And I did that with a private practice family doctor.
Okay.
And that, I would say, was really the formative experience for me in all of medical school. Because I go out to this clinic, and I worked with him for 2 weeks, and then he took 2 weeks off on vacation. And I kept going to the clinic every day, and they had patients scheduled every day.
As the main doctor?
It was me and his nurse practitioner.
Okay.
The two of us taking care of a regular patient panel.
Okay.
Right, that was coming in. And that's the kind of thing, I don't know if that would take place today. I don't.
Right.
It was the end. He was toward the. I think he was at that point already. He was kind of toward the end of his career. I think he represented the end of an era.
Not so afraid of losing a license.
Yes.
Okay. Welcome back to Dear Healthcare, It's You. Welcome back to our podcast. We're here with Dr. Elisha Yaghmai of the Free State Healthcare Clinic here in Wichita. Thank you for being here, Dr. Elisha. What we've been talking about so far is Dr. Elisha Yaghmai's medical journey and what that kind of looked like in going through medical school. And where we've left off, I believe, is with your 4th year. It's kind of where we're picking up today. Mm-hmm. You were in New Orleans during the Hurricane Katrina when that all happened. And so that was part of your medical journey, was being in medical school during that and being shuffled, and then ended up having to transfer to I'm sorry, what was the university one more time?
UT Southwestern.
UT Southwestern,
Yeah,
that's
University
it.
of Texas Southwestern.
And so that's where you ended up finishing your 3rd year, right? Mm-hmm. And so we were kind of talking about the abusive nature of some of the, the hospital settings there and with your faculty and all of that. So what ended up happening in the 4th year? Any changes or more of the same sort of abuse in terms of the kind of lack of oversight in terms of teaching and just expecting a ton in those ways?
Yeah, 3rd year, I think those that, not everyone was abusive. Yeah. Those that were abusive, it wasn't expectations that was the issue. It was the way they executed their sort of theoretical teaching. And for some of them, it was, their criticism was personal, it was persistent, and they created a very difficult work environment. So in other words, they were asking medical students to do things that medical students were really not equipped to do. Yeah. And then when they failed to do it, not reflecting on the fact that this was completely the wrong setup to get the outcome that I wanted, but instead making it extremely personal in terms of the way that they were approaching it, right?
Of like personal attacks.
You are stupid, right? Like that, right?
Right.
Not, hey, this is something that you don't know. Yeah. Hey, let me teach you how to do this better. Very, very different, right? So a kind of teaching style that I think almost anyone in any field would agree is probably not the right way to do it, but actually very common through medical education. Right. So 4th year, I would say there's also one other dynamic particularly in the 3rd year of medical school, at least in the institutions that I was in, and with my own personal experience. A lot of medical education, we talked about this a little bit last time, is fundamentally driven by fear. Right. You have high achieving people who are used to getting really good grades, who are now in an environment with a bunch of other people that are like that. They're all competing with each other because they all want certain prestigious residency programs, whatever the case is, right? Right. So the motivation for many of them, not everyone, but many, is fear of failure or fear of not getting that next gold star, right? So in other words, it's not enough to have gone from high school to a good college and then gone from college to a good medical school and then, go from medical school into a residency. It needs to be the right residency, right? With the right name or the right specialty. And
can I pause you and see, is that something that you feel like looking back is more just something that the type of people that ended up in medical school were putting on themselves as this driving fear? Or is that something that was within the rhetoric of the teaching and such as well? That it was pushed that way.
It's both. Yeah. You have people that are predisposed. They're operating in an environment where that behavior is promoted. Yeah. Because, it doesn't take a genius, right, to, for example, look at the masthead at your medical school and realize that everybody at the top of it, right, seems to they've all got a subspecialty fellowship. Right. The people at the very top seem to have come from one of about 10 institutions in general, right? Yeah. Or spent time training in some of these places, right? You can look at that, and so if your aspiration, and again, I'm not commenting on whether your aspiration is valid or good. Right. But if your aspiration is, what I'd like to do? I'd like to rise in this institution and one day I want to be dean of whatever it is, right? Well, you look at this and say, well, then I think I'm going to probably have to follow a similar path as the people that are already in these positions. Right. Right? So I need to keep clawing my way up that mountain, right, into more and more select programs, at least by reputation, right? Because you don't really know anything about these places from the outside. So the motivation driving a lot of the behaviors is fear rather than love of learning.
Right.
And that's a key difference. And so that, speaking on a personal level, that never worked for me at any point in my education. Mm-hmm. Even as a younger student, my driver had always been, this is so cool. Like I just want to learn this because I think it's interesting, right? And I want to get into it. And we heard early in your story that you were, really driven to wanting to fill a need to help as well. I mean, I think that's probably the start of a lot of people's medical journeys. Yes.
At the start.
Yeah, at the beginning, yes.
Yeah.
And then it gets diluted down
over
time. A lot of the conflict, I think, was that, right? So medicine, first of all, is a high volume of information.
Right.
They're giving you a ton of information over a very short period of time. You need to absorb it, and then you need to be able to regurgitate it in various high-pressure situations, exams, oral exams, on rounds, wherever else, right?
Right.
That doesn't work for everybody, for one. But there's a lot of fear and stress associated with all of those things. And so you have that as one driver. I think the change for me began to take place at the beginning of fourth year. And what they do in fourth year, here again, things change over time, so medical education may have shifted. But fourth year, you had a little bit more freedom. So you're allowed to go out and begin to work with a little bit less of a tight leash. Somebody wasn't standing over your shoulder all the time.
In the hospital settings you're talking about?
In the hospital, so you could do a sub-internship in the hospital, and then also even in the outpatient setting.
Okay.
So I had two experiences. I mean, one was I went from a fairly sort of corrosive work environment actually to my family medicine residency, which took place at John Peter Smith. Shout out to JPS. And the people at John Peter Smith were very different.
And that was in your fourth year?
That was right at the beginning.
After.
That was at the very end of my third year, just before my transition to fourth year. Very different. They cared about medicine. They enjoyed learning and doing things, but they were nice.
Right. Yeah. like not having that huge overarching fear as a part of it all. Is that part of it?
It was just a different culture. That's the best way I can describe it. So they were kind people.
Is that true of everybody in terms of like doctors on down through the facility, or what stands out most?
All I can say is that for the people that I worked with in that place at that time, they exhibited kindness. Yeah. So they still cared about trying to do a good job medically.
Right.
But they were kind. And for a student who had just come from an environment which was the complete opposite of that was a revelation. Because I was like, wow, you can do good medicine and still be a nice person.
Right, yeah. Like an example of someone who didn't get like chewed up by the machine and spit out in that way.
That's exactly correct. And so I went from then into a sub-internship, which I did in the hospital. And there again, I was working with at that point, my closest supervisor was a third year internal medicine resident at that point. I was at Parkland Hospital in Dallas. And he also had more of that, I think, kindness in him. Okay. So it was just a better environment to learn because it was more, it was less about fear of reprisal, fear of repercussion, and more about how are we going to work with this patient today? Okay, that's a positive motivation as opposed to the negative motivation of just trying to not get punched, right?
Right.
These are two very different things.
Or humiliated.
Or humiliated in some way, right? I guess metaphorically punched.
Right,
yeah. Sorry, Southwestern, nobody punched me. Okay.
Legal, we have to say.
Yeah, that's right. But metaphorically, they did. So
emotional abuse is real.
So working with him was that was very helpful.
Yeah.
And there were areas, I mean, thinking back, there were areas definitely where like I either didn't know enough or I couldn't come up with the things on time. But again, it was just a different environment, and it made it encouraging. It made it positive to try to get better.
And when you were in that scenario, just because I'm not used to all the jargon and I don't know exactly how it goes. Yeah. So when this was a residency doctor, what do you call it? What's the terminology?
It's a medical resident.
They were a medical resident.
You go through medical school, you do 4 years of medical school, and then you do a residency of a certain number of years, which is basically you're doing practical work at that point, right? So you have your medical degree, but you're not really allowed to do independent practice until you've done a certain number of years, and it varies by specialty of practice. So in internal medicine, you do 3 years of an internal medicine residency. So when you finish your third year, you're officially done. At that point, after you finish, you could be an independent internal medicine doctor.
So this was someone in their third year of their residency.
Right. So he was in his last year of residency. Right.
And so you go around on rounds with him and basically...
Well, no, you go around on rounds by yourself, actually.
Oh, by yourself.
So you go around by yourself. You have a couple of patients to take care of, right?
Okay.
And you're trying to figure out what to do with them clinically, right? So in third year, you had usually a junior resident in front of you, and then a senior resident, and then the attending physician. Now you're kind of the junior resident. That's how I would describe it. That's why it's a sub-internship. You're not the intern.
Okay.
You're not the first year resident that's there, but you're stepping into that role for a short period of time.
Right.
But what that role facilitated again was independent learning, right?
Yeah.
You've been given a case. Now you need to go. There's no multiple choice exam. You have to go figure out who is this person, what's wrong with them, what am I going to do about it, what do I do? And then you take your plan back to your supervisors and say, here's what I think is going on, here's what I want to do, here's why I want to do it, right? Here's how I'm going to do it. And then they say, thumbs up or no, not a good idea, let's modify, right? And they try to teach you.
So you're handling it all on your own, but you're kind of having this check back with this person ahead of time before you go back for the actual treatment that you're performing.
Yeah.
Okay,
so you can't just order it yourself and no one will check you. It's checked, but your goal is to formulate an independent plan and then bring that in.
So a lot more practical learning in some of those ways for just hands-on, like checking your actual knowledge of how stumped you are or not at a point. Yeah. Okay, gotcha.
So that was a different animal.
Yeah. And so did that last for your whole fourth year then?
No,
doing
that kind
of work?
That was just
one of the.
Yeah.
Okay.
So then you had to do an outpatient kind of sub-internship or outpatient rotation, I guess is what I would say. And I did that with a private practice family doctor.
Okay.
And that, I would say, was really the formative experience for me in all of medical school. Because I go out to this clinic, and I worked with him for 2 weeks, and then he took 2 weeks off on vacation.
Okay.
And I kept going to the clinic every day, and they had patients scheduled every day.
As the main doctor?
It was me and his nurse practitioner. It was the two of us taking care of a regular patient panel.
Okay.
Right, that was coming in. And that's the kind of thing, I don't know if that would take place today. I don't.
Right.
It was the end. He was I think he was at that point already. He was kind of toward the end of his career. I think he represented the end of an era.
Not so afraid of losing a license.
Yes. So he let this fourth year medical student.
Did anything go wrong
Not
during
that I'm
the
aware
time?
of. No, actually, but that was the thing, right? So I understood that responsibility, right? I was like, these people are coming in here.
Rare opportunity, honestly, for a student in your position.
My doctor is gone. He's gone. And this was, but we didn't have email. There was email, right? But we weren't emailing back and forth. Like we didn't have the ready contact. I forget where I think he went out of the country, if I recall correctly.
Oh, wow.
Right?
Okay.
So whether he was checking back in the background to see, I don't know if he may have been doing that, right? But in terms of our direct communication, we weren't communicating. So it was just me, and then his nurse practitioner would see her patients, right? And we would talk about them every day and try to review them. So it was being given responsibility, right? And with that responsibility came, I think it went back to that original motivation, right? I got into this to try to learn a skill to help people. Right. Well, now here I am in a practical situation where these people are coming to me expecting answers. Yeah. What am I going to do, right? I have to know something. So that motivated a lot of, all right, I got to read. I got to look at what cases are coming in and try to learn something before I go in. And then after I talk to them and learn more, I got to go read some more about this, right? And try to educate myself and figure out what to do about these cases. Yeah. And that again was a very positive motivation. The positive motivation was trying to help people with a real problem. It didn't have anything, I wasn't getting a test on it. There was no grade assigned at the end of it or whatever the case was. This was just, people need help. What are you going to do? Now you know at least enough to know where to look to find the answer. Right. Right. Even if you don't know the answer, what are you going to do? Right.
Was there a difference in that scenario also because of it being a outpatient clinic rather than an in-hospital setting?
I mean, the main difference was the different types of problems, right? Yeah. Different types, but occasionally people would come into the outpatient clinic with an inpatient problem, right? Okay. They would come in and they'd be really sick, and we'd have to, order some tests and figure out what to do, and then in some cases you send them to the hospital if you don't have the capability to handle it in the office. So it was different levels of severity and just different types of problems. Right. But I think the main difference was really the work environment. It was the people I was working with. And again, that autonomy and that responsibility of, we expect you to handle this. Right. Right.
Did that did you have a question for yourself prior to that setting of whether you really could handle it? I mean, it sounds like there was a lot of the fear mongering and a lot of that, like, shaming of like not knowing things that you maybe shouldn't know yet even. But to this point, now you're in the last year of medical school. Was that kind of a reassurance of like, this is the right piece for you?
I didn't, even during the roughest times, I would say, I didn't necessarily feel like that it was something I could not do.
Yeah.
I did feel like this is a thing I do not like.
Right, yeah.
I don't know how to describe it. It would be like, just think about anything in your life where you have the ability to do it, but you do not enjoy the thing itself. You don't enjoy that activity. You don't enjoy the process of gaining the skill at it, right?
It's like getting good at running or something like that.
That's probably
for some of us.
Yeah,
like, I mean, where there's like that one where it's like I can do it, I don't enjoy it. Like,
not at all.
But you found some enjoyment in that.
Yeah. I would say for the first time, that's probably the best way to describe it. I actually found some joy in the work.
Nice. For
the very first time ever.
Wow.
Because previously it was just a miserable slog through one requirement after another, sort of competitive environment after another.
How long did that joy last you?
That lasted through most of the fourth year, actually, because you had more freedom to choose your electives, right? So you could do things that were interesting, and you went around and did stuff. And you start interviewing for residency programs, so you're traveling to do that. I did a rotation in forensic pathology, right? Okay. Which is actually even weirder than it appears on TV, but it's actually really cool. It's a cool specialty.
Forensic pathology, is that like, I mean, forensic makes my mind go FBI. Like,
No. It's when people come in dead, right? Yeah, or for whatever reason, they've died in the hospital, they're found dead or whatever, right? Someone has to do an autopsy and try to determine what the cause of death was, right?
Okay.
And forensic pathology was, at least here again in Dallas at that time, was filled with a really eclectic group of people that were just fascinating. Like, just as people, they were really interesting. They were also doctors.
Yeah.
So it was just fascinating. So I learned all kinds of random things.
So is that the same as being a coroner? Is if you're a forensic pathologist?
So you can have a coroner that is not a forensic pathologist, but in a big city, often they would be the one doing that death exam and offering like a reason for cause of death.
Yeah, that is interesting because I mean, isn't that how they learned in the Roman times? They were operating on people after the arena situation stuff because they weren't allowed to work on anyone that was dead at the time. So, right. I mean, but that is a whole different view of the body. I'm sure that like gives you stuff that you're not able to learn off the cuff in class on an autopsy sort of situation.
It was stuff like, okay, when do the bugs show up, right? And then what type of bugs show up? And then, when does rigor mortis set in? When does it not, right? And so that was when you learn, right, that those kind of forensic TV shows, right, it's all baloney. Even they're like, they died 3.5 hours ago. No, they didn't. you have this much wider range.
Did you watch CSI while you were doing that?
I did not. But they would joke about it in there about, like what you could and could not actually tell. So, that kind of thing.
That's interesting. Yeah. So you kind of got to explore some of that. Is that the time when, does the student already know what they're wanting to specialize in, like when they enter medical school, or would that be a time that you're kind of exploring some of that?
So in theory, a lot of people come in with a preconception about what they want to do. Okay. For a lot of people, it changes over the course of medical school, and I was the same. Actually, it shifted for me a couple of different times. By that time, fourth year, usually you have to know already because you have to already have applied.
Oh, okay.
This is a fundamental flaw with medical education in general. You have to decide, in theory, what specialty you want to do. Yeah. And your only real exposure to it, at best, is what you got in your third year of medical school, at best, right? Which is the most. Because you apply before your fourth year. For your residency. As you're starting your fourth year, you're already applying, right? So it's too late. Like, I mean, I guess you could theoretically apply for multiple different types of residencies, but in general, you have to make a choice. Okay. And then you have to apply for it, and then you're locked into that, at least to starting it, right? You're locked into it, and you may not really appreciate, because the difference in medicine between watching someone do a job and then doing the job yourself, there's a big difference between these two things, right? And so something can look really cool when you're not responsible for doing it all day, every day. And it's very, very different when you are, and you don't get that exposure in many cases. So you're making a somewhat blind decision about what you want to do and how you want to do it. Well,
even like what you were saying about your third year with like when you're in the OB department, realizing that I forget which way it was, that you liked being there for vaginal births, but not C-sections, or it's like you don't know that until you do a C-section. You go, maybe not. Well, interesting. And so then, with your fourth year, with that experience, what did you apply for your residency to
So I
be
applied
in
for
at
family
the
medicine.
beginning?
Yeah,
Family
so I applied for
medicine.
family medicine. My thought at that time, so I'd had two things. One was that I'd gone to John Peter Smith,
Yeah.
right, that hospital, and had a really good experience. So I was like, okay, family medicine seems to be like internal medicine, but nice.
Yeah.
and it also it enables you to have a broader skill set because you also see some children and you also do some obstetrics.
Yeah.
And bear in mind, at that point, I still thought, I'm going to go do international medicine at the end of this, right? So I thought, okay, I need to really be able to see a wide variety of ages and do a little bit of a lot of different things. So it seemed like that was the right fit at that point in time.
Okay. Yeah. And so then anything more that you want to share about your fourth year in terms of those experiences?
No, I don't think so. I think, well, there was one interesting experience. Here again, just to kind of convey the culture. Right?
Yeah.
So at one point, I think this was in fourth year, they have a meeting with us at Southwestern. And the meeting was, well, we recently had a really humiliating experience, which was that there were 250 people in the class I think, every year. We had an experience where multiple of our students applied to the same program, and they all claimed to be the #1 ranked student in the class.
Oh my gosh.
and so we went back and looked, and they were pretty much all tied in terms of GPA, so they could validly make that claim.
Oh.
But we heard back from the residencies that said, how can it be possible that you have 4 people that are all #1, right?
Yeah.
So, this is ridiculous. Again, speaking to the culture of medicine, right?
Right, yeah.
We have 4 people that are all ranked #1, like that can't fly. We need to know which one of them
Who
is
is the best?
really #1,
Yeah.
right, out of these. And they realized that their grading wasn't parsed tightly enough to differentiate between #1 and #4. They were too close, right, to tell. So they come in to tell us in this meeting, so we're changing the grading scale. What's going to happen is everyone else's grade is going to get lower, but it's going to enable us to more accurately parse out the grades
those that are
of those
#1
at the very top, right? And so,
Is it really like 4 people that there would be? Or
it was. It was about 4, if I recall correctly. I might be a little off on the detail, but I think it was approximately that number, right? And so you're sitting there and saying, okay, so all of us here have to apply to residencies. We're all going to get lower grades, right? We're all going to get lower grades so that the people at the very top of the class in terms of GPA can differentiate those few hundredths or tenths of a point that they need to decide who's really #1, right? But the reality is all 4 of those people are going to go basically wherever they want because they have a great GPA, right? Coming out of a well-known medical school. So they're not going to have any problems, right? It's a matter of, choosing between Harvard or UCSF in terms of what, something like that.
Yeah.
And everyone else is going to look worse on paper.
Right.
And the reason you've done this is because you were embarrassed because they all went and applied to Penn or whatever, and Penn was mad because they were all ranked #1, right?
Right. Well, and it's almost like they felt embarrassed because they didn't have a hard enough program is what it sounds like.
Yeah. Well, no, it wasn't that it wasn't hard enough.
Not hard enough, but like that it was that they were not like,
it was
parsing
that the grades
it.
were not parsed
in
a finely enough to differentiate between those people.
Were your class standings a really big deal throughout the whole of medical
No,
school?
I mean,
it wasn't
something that was tracked. I don't think I ever even knew what mine was.
Okay.
But like anything else, right? There were people that really did care, right? And they were trying to get an A in everything and get the highest grade and the highest score. And again, why were they doing that? Well, some of them were motivated because they loved medicine. A lot of them it was because, I'm not going to get into that residency. I'm not going to get into my dermatology residency unless I have an A in everything, right?
Right.
So it didn't matter what it was. It didn't matter whether they cared about it. They were going to get an A in it. Right?
Yeah.
And it didn't even matter ultimately whether they knew it in a fundamental sense. Like was the knowledge absorbed and retained, or was it just absorbed and put onto the test and then moved on? That also was really not relevant.
Yeah.
It was a matter of, do I get an A so that I can get into the residency that I want?
Right.
That was, for some, the driver.
And the residency, the specific residency had the importance of the place of like where the residency was, but then also the type of residency. Is that?
Yes, what specialty it is and then what name is on the door.
Right.
Both things are relevant to the people that cared about that.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And so then when did you end up starting your residency? What year are we in, dateline wise?
So now this is my 5th year of medical training. So I finished my 4th year of medical school and then I started residency.
So is this 2006?
Oh, no, now in terms of, that was 2000, that was the summer of 2007.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So now 2007, you're starting your residency. Where did you end up going for that?
So I ended up at the family medicine residency at Via Christi in Wichita, Kansas.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's how you came to Wichita?
That's how I came here. Yeah.
Gotcha. Mm-hmm. Well, welcome. Post, not posthumously, but I don't know what the word is. Welcome to Wichita. Wichita. Yeah. I was not here yet at the time, but so Via Christi, and you were doing family medicine there. Yeah. And so does your residency, do you still like focus on specific, I don't know how residencies work. Do you change location throughout it? Do you change specialties throughout it, like focus at all?
No, you don't. So you pick a specialty, and then you start doing rotations within that specialty. Okay. So in family medicine world, for example, it might be an inpatient specialty. You might have some clinic time. Okay. You might have pediatrics. You might have obstetrics, sports medicine, a general surgery rotation. Okay. And you go around to these different things and try to pick up different skills and knowledge that you would need to use. Again, kind of family medicine approaches things from a broad perspective, right? Okay. So you're trying to gain a broader base of knowledge in all of these different areas. And so you may rotate from site to site or whatever, but you're generally in typically one geographic region doing these different rotations. Okay. And how long are the rotations for? Typically about a month. A month, okay. Yeah. And what was your experience with, like, at Via Christi? What type of rotations did you do? Yeah. What were your kind of takeaways from it? So it was it was quite different from what medical school had been. It was a very different culture. Yeah. In a positive or negative way? Mostly in a positive way. Yeah. There were aspects of it now that there were aspects of it that weren't good. I mean, I ended up changing residencies, right? So I had some issues with it, but the culture overall, I think, was a positive. Probably, I would say there were two really good aspects of it. One, at least from my perspective, one was that they allowed a significant amount of autonomy. Yeah. Which, I mean, it sounds like you really flourished in that kind of learning environment. I did, yeah. And so I'm assuming a lot of people probably need that. Some do and some don't. It's quite different. No, I mean, there's wide differences in medicine and personality and learning style. So some people need a regimented like oversight. Yeah. Like, you're gonna work through these things in a structured, disciplined manner. Right. And other people do much better if they're allowed to learn through doing and learn through the practical experiences that are rolling across their plate. So, but Via Christi at that time was very autonomous. What I mean by that, here again, and some of the medical people will cringe when they hear this, because from a patient care perspective, it was a little dicey, right? But so you would come in as an intern, and you would be on call for the hospital. Yeah. Like the whole hospital. Oh. You were the person on call to admit patients to the hospital, to handle cross-cover calls. If somebody started going downhill in the ICU, that was your job, right? You were to go around and do all of those things. Yeah. So the plus side of that was you had the weight, again, of that responsibility. Right. So you had to try to figure out what to do. Mm-hmm. The downside of it was you had, 2 months of medical experience outside of medical school. Right. And you're trying to run an ICU. Right. Right. And in theory, there was a senior resident that was supposed to be on call with you. But in practice, what ended up happening was that they would usually go to the OB floor because there were OB deliveries and things going on all the time. They were running that. And the intern was frequently, at least when I was there, was frequently out there basically on their own running the medical floor. Because what did you call it? Senior resident. The senior resident, right. They were was otherwise needed. They were, Right. So lack of, and I mean, that's another glimpse of just a lack of enough care on the floor. Yeah, well, the issue was the patient, here again in retrospect, what patients don't understand is how heavily dependent their care is on who they get. When you roll into a hospital, your care depends very, very much on who specifically you get. Yeah. Patients have this idea that MD equals MD, right? A doctor is a doctor is a doctor is a doctor, and that is not at all true. Right. It's not at all true. And so imagine, right, you roll into this hospital with your illness, and the person that's treating you is me, who has just finished medical school a month ago. Right. Right. Brand new to Wichita. and is trying to kind of figure all of this stuff out, right? Yeah. Is in the first environment with some higher level of responsibility. Yeah. And is trying to learn medicine, is trying to do all these things. And that's largely who's taking the calls in your care and who's and it's not that there's not an attending physician. They're at home, right? Right. There is an attending physician, but who's deciding what's important, right? Because if a nurse calls, the intern who got the call decides, is this important enough that I need to escalate it up the chain and inform the attending physician? Do I need to inform my senior resident? Do you see what I'm saying, right? It's a whole new internalized flow chart that we've talked about earlier about your muscle memory of what questions to ask. It's the same thing, but prioritizing of whether to run it up that chain of command or whether you can handle it. That's yourself. Correct, right? Yeah. And how do you do it? And so that was a significant responsibility, right? I think it's arguable whether an intern should really shoulder that entirely by themselves, but that was how it was done, and that was again that had flowed through from the culture of medicine that had existed for decades, right? It wasn't just in this place; this was in a lot of places, right? Like I said in Dallas, right? The guy just took a vacation and was like, "Here you go, medical student, figure it out," right?
See you in 2 weeks.
So on the one hand, it's a vote of confidence. On the other hand, you can look back and see how you could have some suboptimal outcomes.
Yeah, definitely.
From that.
Well, we're out of time for this episode, but we'll be catching up with you again, and we'll be picking up where we left off about how you changed residencies and why that happened, okay?
All right.
Thanks for being here. Thanks, guys.